formerly Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, formerly presidential candidate in Nigeria. He is the chairman of the board of the Africa Private Sector Summit. He is one of our own, but globally relevant, Professor Kingsley Moghalu, OON.
Governors, several states here represented, very distinguished personalities, ladies and gentlemen, all other protocols observed. My name is Kingsley Moghalu, and I have the great honor to be your keynote speaker at this event this morning. I'm very humbled, and I thank the leadership group for deeming me worthy to serve in this capacity. Before I go into my lecture, which I'll try to keep to about 30, 35 minutes, max 40, or 30 minutes actually. We will not go more than 30 minutes. But the lecture will be in written form, and we will make it available to everyone with details. So I'll simply summarize it. But before I do so, I just want to say that I'm here as a professional. I'm here as a technocrat and nothing else. I'm here as a patriot as well, a man who loves this country. It's sometimes our habit in Nigeria to filter things through various lenses. And so I want to be very clear who I am at this occasion and where I'm coming from. I am not a politician. I want to be very clear. Yes, it is historically a fact that I ran for president at some point, but I am not a politician at all. I ran simply because I felt the country was going into the ground. And simply, I expressed myself by presenting Nigeria with a different vision. And I think we made some impact that opened the way for other people to come. And I think the rest is history. So let me go into my keynote remarks this morning. And our subject is Nigeria's distressed economy. Which way forward? That is the topic of the moment. And let me begin by saying, let me get my watch out so that I can time myself. So I want to begin by saying that every choice we make has consequences. But we have no choice over the combined consequences of the choices we have made. I want us to let that sink in for a minute. Every choice that we make has consequences, but we have no choice over the combined consequences of the choices that we have made. Nigeria's economy today is, to use the title of the classic novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. That novel was called The Chronicle of a Death Foretold. Chronicle of a Death Foretold. The question is, will there be a resurrection? I believe so, but only if we fix the fundamentals. There is nothing that is happening today, the hyperinflation, the crisis of the value of the naira, debt distress and revenue challenge, unemployment, and extreme poverty, etc., that should surprise any thinking citizen or professional observer of how our country's economy has been mismanaged for a very long time. Choices have consequences, and we should not be surprised that there is hunger and anger in the land today. The past 10 years were particularly ruinous. They were the years of the locust, marked by unprecedented mismanagement of fiscal policy, unproductive external borrowing, unnecessary budget deficits, illegal ways and means lending by the Central Bank of Nigeria to the federal government to the tune of 30 trillion naira, and unprecedented corruption. Many of these things happened because, as we witnessed, there was a successful political assault on the independence of the Central Bank of Nigeria, with the storekeeper willingly handing over the keys to the store to the marauders. We are in a crisis today, ladies and gentlemen. Regardless of whatever short-term measures that are taken and the success of those measures or the lack of it, this crisis and its effects will last for at least 3 to 5 years. Don't be deceived. We're not getting out of this tomorrow. We may see some success tomorrow morning, we may see some setbacks, but the crisis is so fundamental that its effects will be with us for some few years to come at the very least. Now, we must not waste the present economic crisis. That's my view. This crisis must not be wasted. We mustn't let it become like every other crisis we have, and we keep going from crisis to crisis. The question we have to answer today: when will we address the fundamentals that ail the Nigerian economy? There is no better time than now in a time of crisis. So as we try to get out of the crisis, let us address the root causes of our crisis so that we do not have these kinds of crises again. I think that that is the best response that we could possibly have to this crisis. I maintain my position, which is a matter of record, that the decisions to remove the petrol subsidy and forex subsidy were bold decisions and were correct. We have lived a lie for 40 years, and the chickens have come home to roost. Given the country's revenue challenges in the crude oil production and export sector, Nigeria could no longer afford to subsidize the importation of refined petrol, at least fully, and could no longer afford to defend the value of the naira artificially. We simply did not have and do not have the foreign reserves to continue to do that. Nevertheless, there are also some immediate causes of today's economic mess that can be directly traced to strategic errors by the present government early in its 7 months in office so far. So the point I'm making is that although the foundation for our economic crisis was laid by previous governments with extreme reckless mismanagement of fiscal policy, we have all the evidence of that. But the current government, which met the crisis and inherited it, also made some important mistakes. And I will point it out, not for recrimination, but simply as lessons learned for the future. So, the first mistake, I believe, was the precipitate nature of the introduction of these reform policies without a thorough preparation for the morning after. Now, Nigerians should have been educated first on the economics of why these subsidies had to go and on what steps the government was taking to mitigate the anticipated impact. For example, with a subsidized mass transportation system across the 774 local government areas of Nigeria. Because everybody knows that when you remove subsidy or when subsidy ends, the first place it's going to hit is in the transport sector. And that will have multiplier effects with the cost of transportation of foodstuff and all those kinds of things. So that's the first mistake that was made. The second mistake that was made was that the exchange rate unification and a further effort to quote-unquote float the naira in an environment that was already awash with naira liquidity, that is to say, a loose monetary environment, was an error. This contributed to the naira's race to the bottom. But we know the policy should have been accompanied or preceded by immediate monetary tightening before you float the naira or before you try to unify the exchange rate. Because with so much money sloshing around, so much naira, what you find is that a lot of naira is being used to mop up the dollars, and that's putting demand pressure on the dollars, and the dollar continues to rise, the naira continues to fall. But if money is scarce, which is what happens when you tighten monetary policy, then you will not have that effect. You will have some of it, but not as much as we have had. So that's the reason that was a bit of a mistake. But we know that a substantive governor of the central bank was appointed only several months later. And the Monetary Policy Committee was only just appointed and confirmed last month, I believe. The fact that these two important institutional props of Nigeria's economic policy making were not in place for several months after the new administration was sworn in created policy uncertainty and damaging gaps in investor confidence. Again, like I said, it is simply for lessons to be learned for the future. Even though investors were broadly supportive of the reform direction, the central bank's recent action of raising the monetary policy rate by 400 basis points and the cash reserve ratio, although belated, is appropriate in our circumstances. Better late than never. I know many people have criticized this action, but I think it's important to have a full reason as to why it is so. It is done because even though many would argue that what we have today is not demand pull inflation, but it is cost push inflation. Yes, but one of the biggest sources of cost push inflation is the foreign exchange rate, the forex market. And so I believe, I don't speak for the central bank, not anymore, but my own interpretation was that that action was a double strike, not only at the money supply, but also at the forex rate, to give confidence to investors to bring in more dollars because they have been wanting to see monetary policy tightening. And because when you tighten money, the demand pressure on the dollar is less. So it's a double strike. And most important, in a time of crisis such as this, the most important imperative is to stabilize the macroeconomy of Nigeria. Without stabilization, there can be no growth. So let us be very clear. And that's why I supported the central bank's policy action. The third mistake was that the president's cabinet took too long to be formed in a sensitive period of transition. When the appointments were finally made, the cabinet's composition turned out to be predominantly political, instead of a strong bench of apolitical technocrats to address the economic crisis which investors had hoped for. This, in my humble view, was a lost opportunity. It is always the case that when a government inherits an economic mess of humongous and fundamental proportions, the wiser course of action is to invest in the confidence of both the investor community that will keep the economy going, and to also invest in the confidence of the citizens. And so, if you prioritize politics, you pay a price for it. One of the prices we're paying is where we are now. As I was saying, every choice has consequences. Economic revival. The fundamentals we must address. I want to say very quickly that the best way to solve the economic crisis we're in now is simply to understand everything that caused and led to the crisis. If we understand those things and fix them, you have fixed the crisis and you have paved the path for the future. I am not one of those Nigerians that always rushes to, tell us the practical now, we don't want theory. There can be no practical without a sound theory. That is just fact. And industrialized countries know this. But in Nigeria, we call theories and concepts grammar. That man is blowing grammar. But you wonder why every society that has made progress, they are blowing grammar. Because they are engaging with ideas. Ideas rule the world. So, what brought us here? Number one, the absence of nationhood. You will be surprised to understand that many of the things that affect our economy are not strictly technical economic issues. No, not at all. The main reason we are where we are, the fundamental reason, is the absence of nationhood. Why do I say this? Economic development and transformation can only be achieved if the quest for these outcomes is anchored on a shared understanding of nationhood. This is a task of nation building. When a country's population has a shared destiny, when they have a shared sense of purpose, then they all come together, put their shoulder at the wheel to produce for subsistence, for survival, and for prosperity in the same direction. There is no better example of this than the United States. The Revolutionary War of 1776, the country's Constitution of 1787, guaranteed property rights. Property rights were guaranteed in that Constitution. The inviolability of contracts and the rule of law were guaranteed in that Constitution. In fact, it is not a surprise that in the very first early articles of the US Constitution, there is a provision for the protection of intellectual property and innovation. So you find that innovation and intellectual property in America, which is what has driven the wealth of the world's strongest economy, are actually grounded in the Constitution. It is not about anybody going to cut a tape that we've opened this innovation center. No, the country was built on the foundation of that understanding. So there are shared values that have made that country strong. There are many other countries of good examples. You have Singapore. Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, and they had a chip on their shoulder because of that incident. And they swore that in Singapore will be more successful than the country that kicked them out. That is the shared sense of nationhood and destiny. We have Taiwan, expelled from mainland China after the Civil War. We have Japan, which dominated East Asia in the early 20th century before the rise of China. These are several examples of countries whose economies have been built on the back of a strong sense of nationhood. Number two, bad governance brought us where we are. I don't need to go into too many details. There are too many manifestations of bad governance in Nigeria's national life, because there is no shared understanding of the Nigerian state and its purpose. The real aims of politics, the contest for power and authority, are not good governance, but actually self-aggrandizement, corruption, ethnic irredentism, and so many of these other things. When you cannot govern the country well, you cannot manage the economy well. The economy is a fundamental aspect of governance. What is the purpose of government in the Nigerian Constitution? To protect, to improve the welfare of Nigerians and to protect their citizens. Those are governance issues. And because we have not had very good governance, it is no surprise that we have not been able to build a good economy, and we keep having economic crisis. A state that lacks the capacity to protect its citizens and control its territory, administer taxation effectively, and administer social services such as health, education, and social security. Note, I'm not talking about palliatives. I'm talking about systemic social security. The palliative economy is no economy, and it solves nothing. So, we have seen the impact. We have seen the impact of insecurity on food security and therefore inflation. So all these things are interconnected. 3, ad hocism and lack of strategy. Any crisis in Nigeria, the first knee-jerk reaction, create a committee. Create a committee. That is not a strategy. A committee is not a strategy. A committee is a group of men and women who have access to the people in power most of the time. And I can tell you that while they're supposedly doing the committee work, they are looking out for their own interests. So, the real issue in governance and economic transformation is strategy. We have to have a real strategy of governance and economic management in our country. But we are permanently in ad hoc reactive mode towards crisis, including the present one. So, real strategy is what will make a difference. The United Arab Emirates is one example of a country that has been built, its economy has been built on the foundation of strategy. In 1971, 90% of the GDP of UAE was oil. Today, it is less than 30%. In 50 years, with a conscious strategy, the UAE has doubled and increased its GDP more than 247 times since 1971. From 6.5 dirham when the union was established to 1.6 trillion dirham today. That is strategy speaking. Long before many people knew what sovereign wealth funds were, these countries were setting up sovereign wealth funds. We came to the sovereign wealth party very late when the party was already over. And even then, our coming to it was opposed by some people who said, well, you cannot be saving for the rainy day when the rain has already started beating us. Let us chop the money now and divide it. Don't save for the future, I beg. That is not for me. When you hear this type of talk, you know that a country has no strategy. You know that a country is in trouble. 4, the absence of philosophy and knowledge. Every successful economy in this world is anchored on a philosophical foundation. There is no getting away from it, i.e., grammar. There is no running away from it, except you don't want to be successful, or you want to just keep having crisis after crisis, as is our situation in this country. So, we need to have a philosophical foundation. We are suffering from philosophical confusion. We do not know if we are capitalist, if we are a mixed economy, if we are socialist. And we have swerved from different extremes to different extremes over different governments in this country. Today, we are back to what I think is a free market and capitalist kind of thinking. But for you to be able to be successful with that, you've got to understand the foundations of successful capitalism. That is to say, number 1, property rights. Number 2, innovation. Number 3, access to capital. We don't have property rights in Nigeria. Land, the most important property, is controlled by the state. There is no economy in Nigeria that is built on innovation. Occasionally, we see our young people invent wonderful things. We see them on our newspapers, we clap for them. But you don't see their products mass-produced, mass-manufactured on the shelves in the market. That's what you see in America. That's what you see in Japan. That's what you see in Germany. That's what you see in China. That's what leads to greatness. Innovation is the secret of the rise of nations. Innovation. Access to capital, we don't have. The only people who have access to capital in Nigeria are the rich. They take the loans from the banks and they don't pay the bank loans. And there is no consequence. They have access to capital. But the poor man on the street, the vulcanizer, the trader, the artisan, they don't have access to capital. If they don't have access to capital, we cannot create wealth. Because that's how countries rise. China took 600-700 people out of poverty and into the middle class. That's because the poor at the bottom of the pyramid had access to capital. So when we say we are capitalists, let's be clear what we are doing and what we are not doing. Number 5, financialization and deindustrialization. Nigeria has progressively been deindustrialized over the past 40 years. Instead, our economy has been increasingly financialized without a productive base. The banks and bankers are kings, serving a rentier political class for healthy profit, while productive sectors suffer. So, we need to go back to industrialization. 6, electricity. Let there be light. Let there be light. Without electricity, you cannot build an economy. So it is the primary issue for us when we're thinking about our economy. We always talk about the Naira exchange rate. The Naira exchange rate is not the cause of Nigeria's problem. The Naira exchange rate is a reflection of Nigeria's economic problem. The absence of a productive economy that exports and earns forex. If you don't have that, you'll keep having currency crisis. So let's be very clear. Number 7. By the way, speaking of electricity, we all know what has happened in Aba recently. The inauguration of Aba, the geometric power thing. Let's watch it. It's a very important experiment for this country, and we hope it succeeds. Because we need more of that. We need it in Lagos and Ogun State. We need it in Nnewi and Onitsha. We need it in Kano. We must prioritize our industrial manufacturing centers in our electricity provision for this country. That is strategy. Number 7, population crisis. I don't need to dwell too much on this. Nigeria has a population crisis. And when millions of people are being brought into this world without education, without health care, without incomes to take good care of them, what you're doing is that you're creating an economic environment that has negative implications for both the economy and for security. And let us not forget that we are predicted that there will be 400 million people in 2050. That will make us the 3rd largest economy in the world. Now, let me speak very quickly about the way forward, possible solutions. I want to say that I run a think tank, the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation. Forgive me to put in a plug for ourselves, but we are always available to help any government, federal or state in this country, with training, with research, with consultancies, to solve problems of the economy and problems of governance. The way forward, possible solutions. The first recommendation that I'm going to make is that the federal government should raise a 20 trillion naira bond to fund a strategic project for fundamental economic rebirth. This project, which I will call, for the purposes of our discussion, Project 3 in 3, will be aimed at the rebirth of 3 strategic sectors within 3 years. These sectors are railways, housing, and agriculture. The federal government should raise this bond and build railway lines that connect every state capital in this country. Goods can move around, people can move around. It will be a big boost for the economy. Housing, affordable housing, quality housing, mortgage ready. These things will put 5 million Nigerians to work across the states of the Federation. That will boost the economy massively. The details are in my presentation. For the sake of time, I will not go into them. The second recommendation is that fiscal policy must wake up. Fiscal policy must wake up. The problem with our economy is mainly the failure of fiscal policy. And that's the reason we find the central bank always overburdened. Always overburdened. One former head of state called me one day and said, "Kingsley, I have a question for you." I said, "Yes, sir. Why is it that everything in this country seems to be about the central bank?" And I said, "Your Excellency, it's because the state has failed. The state has failed. The executive, the fiscal authorities, they are not able to manage our economy. So it's very easy and very lazy to have a recourse to the central bank. Call me the governor. Create one intervention fund. Create this." And so the central bank became the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Industries, the Ministry of Arts and Theater, the Ministry of whatever. You woke up in the morning and wanted the central bank to be, and you were the president that could, summon the central bank governor. Well, like I said, the independence of the bank was destroyed. And that's why, one of the major reasons why we have what we have today. independence of institutions. We wonder why people make noise about them, but it is so critical that you separate politics from institutions. Separate politics and institutions. We're a democracy, so we know that politicians are not, it's not illegal to be a politician, with all due respect to politicians here. But there's a difference between politics and governance. And when you bring politics into governance, it's like just putting sand into Gary. You will never have a good outcome, because objectivity, competence, merit, all those things are set aside to subject, to advance parochial interests, to advance subjective interests. That's what happens in our country, and that's why we don't go far. So fiscal policy must wake up. 3, we must end oil theft and corruption in this country. By many estimations, almost half of Nigeria's oil production is stolen. How can any country that relies on such a resource for foreign exchange not have problems? Number 4, the central bank should continue its recently announced monetary tightening policy stance. But beyond the actions that the central bank is taking, the bank must demonstrate a willingness to go hard on forex speculation that is going on in Nigeria's banking sector. It is not enough to attack the people in Binance who have no political godfathers in Nigeria. It's not enough. What about the banks? What about the bank CEOs? We know that there's a lot going on in the banks. The central bank should deal with that. When we were in the central bank, we were not afraid. Under Sanusi, the governor of the bank, and I served as deputy governor for financial stability, we took on the banks and brought them under discipline. Under discipline. When you take action against 1 or 2 banks that are found to be hoarding forex, I tell you, everybody will sit up. That's what's going to happen. Somebody wrote an article that is floating around about Ikoyi economics and Fadei economics. You must combine Ikoyi and Fadei. Raising the monetary policy rate is Ikoyi, economics, but it has relevance too. Knocking the heads of criminals in this country, regardless of how important they are, is Fadei, and it is also necessary. Number 6, to get out of our foreign exchange crisis, the federal government must carefully consider. I said consider. I didn't say go and do it, but consider very carefully, after which you take a decision, whether or not we should take a 20 to 30 billion naira stabilization package from the International Monetary Fund. I know the IMF is a dirty word in this country, but let me tell you that we are here not for the usual, but to think outside the box. That's why you invited me to keynote this thing. I didn't come here to be politically popular with anybody. We must consider this option, but we should consider it very carefully with experts looking at it to know whether it will help or it will hurt. What is the point I'm making? All the things we're doing in this country are IMF prescriptions. Removing the subsidy is a prescription of the IMF and the World Bank. But you're doing it, you have all the pain. People are suffering, but you don't get any benefit from it. If you take a $30 billion stabilization package, you take the pain, but you have money. That money can help to stabilize the reserves. It can help to stabilize the forex market. So there's a pro and there's a con. Thank you. But we should consider it. Again, the details are in my lecture, what the pros and cons are. Number 7, the president should create, following careful consideration, a full-time, highly professional, and full-time economic advisory council of 7 economists. I'm very specific in my recommendation. 7 economists. Those economists should have specializations in agricultural economics, industrial policy, labor economics, business economics, trade policy, fiscal policy, and development economics or political economy. These 7 wise men and women, between these specializations, you have what it takes to address the crisis today and tomorrow, to build an economy that can actually function. But if you set up an economic team and you're not thinking about what I've just told you, Oh, just bring me this guy, bring me that guy. No, that is not strategy. You have to think, what is the purpose of this economic team? What are the competencies that must be present in that team? How do they work together to produce the result we want? The result of the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, in Nigeria. That's what we want. Now, I'm aware that the president recently formed an economic advisory council made up of some businessmen, some politicians, and all of that. My suggestion, very, very humbly, that is not an economic team. Sorry to be blunt about it. Sorry to be blunt about it. They are distinguished people. They are capable people. But what that represents, in my view, is a consultative group of the private sector. So you can rename it the State Business Advisory Council. That's what that is. When you want to talk about an economic team, that's exactly what I've told you how to do it. And it has to be full-time. No economy can be managed by part-time advisors. No, it doesn't work like that. And when you have people who are in business, you have to worry about possible conflicts of interests. So you must set up a full-time professional team. They do nothing else but watch the economy and advise the president on what to do. That's what we need. And I say this because the previous government did the same thing. They appointed an economic advisory council that was part-time, made up of distinguished people, but where is the economic transformation that has happened? Because the concept was not the right concept. So that's what I would advise. Also, we must cut the cost of governance. We must cut the cost of governance. Governance in this country is bleeding the economy. Every budget we make in this country is a budget that legalizes corruption. A full 40 to 50% of it is GBT. GBT. Yaunti, yaunti, yini, yini, psyche, psyche, like Fela would say. Let us be honest with ourselves. We should sell down some government assets under the oversight of the Ministry of Finance Incorporated, Murphy, and raise $18 to $20 billion that will be pumped into the reserves. We should end the populist, corruption-riddled palliative economy and develop and implement an effective social security system. In this paper called Nigeria's Poverty Trap and How to End It, our think tank, the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation, developed the A to Z of how to end poverty in this country. You may not know about it because I am not in government and talking to you. But thank God I have this podium today. If you want a solution to poverty, come to us. We'll tell you how to do it. We must implement a population policy in this country. We also must design and implement a blueprint to increase Nigeria's electricity output to 20,000 megawatts within 3 years, driven by private sector investments and anchored on the principle of sustainable energy transition. Finally, or just before finally, President Tinubu needs to revamp his cabinet, not later than his first-year anniversary in office. Why do I say so? I believe that if he does this, it will improve and increase public and investor confidence in the capacity of his government to grapple effectively with the current economic crisis. And finally, President Tinubu, his government should adopt and domesticate the 24-point Private Sector Bill of Rights advocated by the Africa Private Sector Summit, of which I have the honor to be the chairman, in order to improve the investment and business environment in Nigeria and position Nigeria as Africa's largest economy to take advantage of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Conclusion. Let me conclude, and I'll leave you in peace. The best approach to exiting Nigeria's economic malaise and its potential for social unrest is to think and move with strategy, not with populist knee-jerk reactions that only create new and further opportunities for corruption. To think structurally and lay long-term foundations. To fix Nigeria's crisis today, we must act for tomorrow and deal with all the issues that have brought us to where we are. In economic reform, you cannot do one thing and not the other. You must do all the things that are required. That's how reforms succeed. So removing the subsidy is just one component of the reforms. It's not enough. If you focus only on it, you will continue to have problems. But there are other things that must happen as part of that reform. That's called systems thinking. Let there be no doubt. We can beat this crisis. We can. We can. We can. We can. We can save tomorrow for our young people. But we must ask ourselves honest questions and answer them honestly. What is the purpose of political power and government? To improve the welfare of the masses and create national wealth, or to create personal wealth and serve vested interests? To vaunt our tribes, or to build a nation? Is it endless politics for its own sake, or is it effective governance? When we look in the mirror, we should see one figure. The average GDP per capita of Nigeria since independence, that is more than 60 years now, the average GDP per capita is $2,000. That is a testament of failure. Let us be honest with ourselves. That after 60 years of independence, all we can boast of is this. What will our GDP per capita be in the next 10 to 15 years? That is the question we must answer today. Nigeria is too important to fail. If it fails, we all have failed. Most of all, those of us who have been entrusted with the responsibility to secure our today and tomorrow. When we compare where we are today with where many other countries are, with the talents that are bound in our God-blessed country, we should have a new resolve that we are God's children too, and that we deserve a place under the sun. It's time to stop the worship of the God of small things, corruption, tribalism, cronyism, nepotism, mediocrity. This religion is why we are poor and our economy is comatose today. It is time for a new religion, meritocracy, strategy, discipline, competence, integrity in governance, the organizing principle. Thank you.
Thanks for checking out Symphony on YouTube. Please be sure to subscribe and like our videos for updates.